Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation. Today, we're talking about the future of commuting after the pandemic. I'm Sandy Johnson, President Emeritus of the National Press Foundation. Thank you to our sponsors, Bayer and the Foreign Press Correspondents, USA. I'd like to mention two upcoming NPF training programs for journalists. A June 22nd webinar on solving the microchip shortage. This NPF briefing will explain how the semiconductor and chip market got so concentrated, how major economies, including the US and China, came to outsource this critical component to Taiwan, and why new semiconductor plants are so expensive to build. And a July 22nd webinar on how big data is changing scientific standards. In this half-day NPF training aimed at health and science reporters, we'll dive into what's behind the evidence that powers medical knowledge. Right now, we're helping journalists understand what happens when millions of Americans return to the office in the coming months, or not. With us today are Robert Puentes, President of the Eno Center for Transportation, Gregory Winfrey, Agency Director of the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, and transportation reporter Henry Graybar of Slate. Welcome. So let's start with Greg. What did we learn from the great working from home experiment of the pandemic?
Thanks so much for the question, Sandy. It's a pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists, and good morning all. I would say one of the lasting lessons from the pandemic is that American workers can be productive anywhere, including from home or other locations remote from a central office. Telecommuting opens up more workforce opportunities to more people. However, it'll be interesting to see how businesses will alter their operations and/or move to get the workforce or to get to the workforce that they need. The ability to work from home also opens up more job opportunities for workers and improves retention for businesses. Flexible work from home schedules also have tremendous potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce congestion on our roadways, and all of the other attendant environmental benefits. But some of the challenges, as we saw early in the pandemic, are how to accommodate those workers that still need to come in to the workplace. So those challenges remain.
Henry and Robert, anything to add about what we've learned so far?
Well, I guess to state the obvious, so much of this experimentation has occurred during the pandemic, which has otherwise changed our lives in so many other ways. So I don't think anyone here is doing this, but I think we should all be careful not to expect what has happened in the last year to necessarily determine what happens going forward, because there obviously we combined the working from home experiment with there was a lot of noise involved in this experiment.
Yeah, I'll say I'm glad you called it an experiment, because it isn't anything we could have engineered by ourselves, right? We had this whole thing forced upon us, and everybody was forced to adapt. And I think we have seen that those folks who can do it, whose jobs accommodate it, whose home life accommodates it, it worked pretty well. But it's important to also recognize that it wasn't everybody, right? I think that especially for blue collar or white collar professions like mine, and then the fields I run around in, people say, well, everybody's commuting or everybody's working from home these days. And it's certainly not the case. It's highly correlated to things like income levels and education levels, and especially the jobs in which people are working. So it's important to recognize that while some people can commute or telecommute, an awful lot of people still can't.
Robert, let's build on that. Look into your crystal ball and tell us what you think the future holds for working from home.
Well, I think a lot of this is going to stay. As Greg and Henry were saying, it works really well, and people really like it. I think what we've seen is that people who can do it really do appreciate the flexibility, especially people with kids and all kinds of different things. So I think some of it is here to stay. It depends on how much, right? But even if it's once every 2 weeks, let's say somebody is telecommuting, that's a 10% reduction in their in normal commuting times. And that's pretty significant, right? And so there are transportation demand planners who spend their entire careers trying to get that needle to move, an infinitesimal amount, and to get it to move, 10% or more is pretty significant. So I do think a lot of this is here to stay, but again, it's not everybody. And wealthy, highly educated, white and white collar workers are the ones who tend to have been able to telecommute and who probably will continue to telecommute more than others. If you are lower educated, lower income, Black or brown person, you're probably not telecommuting just based on the statistics. So when we think about what's here to stay and we think about the permanence of all of this, we have to be careful not to overemphasize who is benefiting from this as we make public policy decisions, especially transportation public policy decisions around what the future of the commute is going to look like.
And Greg and Henry, any crystal ball thoughts?
I would just kind of double down on what Robert and Henry said about this being an experiment. I use the term forced experiment with my team because when I first came aboard in 2016, fresh from the federal government, I was a fan of telework and thought it might be something we could implement. But being kind of an old line organization, it was a whoa, not too fast. So having gone through this forced experiment and now seeing that we can remain productive and that folks can remain engaged and that platforms like Zoom and others facilitated at least 2-dimension, if not 3-dimension ability to gather. We were favorably impressed by how we survived 2020.
And I forgot to throw out some numbers. I mean, just there's great data that's coming from the Dallas Fed. They've been doing some research on work from home, especially during the last few months with a couple of academics. And it seems to be about 25% is where it's kind of leveling off. And if you look at, I think there's some studies from McKinsey and some other folks looking at the future of telework off into the next couple of decades, that's where they seem to be settling around 20, 25, 30%. Obviously, there's a lot of variance in that, but that seems to be what we're looking at here in the future.
So Greg, how many people stayed off the roads during the pandemic?
Well, it's fair to say, and I would imagine folks on this call witnessed a dramatic reduction in traffic congestion during the pandemic. Probably between 30 to 50% of the vehicle miles traveled were pulled off the roads. Now, some locations in the US are still 5 to 15% under 2019 traffic congestion levels, but traffic delay is returning, unfortunately. The 2021 version of TTI's Urban Mobility Report, which is considered by many to be the definitive or the most definitive periodic study of America's growing traffic congestion problem, will be released to media on June 29. The study focuses on 494 US urban areas and will illustrate how the pandemic reduced traffic delay to levels not seen since 1991. But the respite, unfortunately, is short-lived, and it's only a matter of time before we will see some overall reduction, but it may be imperceptible depending on the urban area in which you live.
Reporters, mark your calendars for June 29th. Greg just gave you a teaser for the TTI report that will be coming out then, and it's a great opportunity for you to localize your reporting on this issue. Henry, describe remote work suburban traffic patterns that occurred during the pandemic.
Well, I think we're just figuring it out, but there was definitely some optimism during the pandemic that we might be entering a new era of, clear skies. I think we've all seen the photos from, for example, Los Angeles, where you just see like crystal clear San Gabriel Mountains looming behind downtown LA. And I think one thing that the last few months have shown is that a lot of those gains were temporary and are now vanishing. And so even though transit use is well below its pre-pandemic levels, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a moment, traffic has come surging back. And at first, I think this seems a little counterintuitive when we recognize how much driving, how many driving miles involve commuting. While commuting is not the majority of trips, commutes tend to be the longest trips that people take every day. So if we have all these white collar commuters in the suburbs who aren't driving to work anymore, how is it that driving has rebounded to pre-pandemic levels? And I think there's a couple ways to think about this. One is the idea of linked trips, which is, let's say that you have a suburban bank employee or something like that, a corporate employee who used to go downtown every day for work And this person would park their car and then visit, they had a gym, let's say, that was next to their office. And they would go to the gym in the morning and then go to the office. And then they had a shoe repair guy who was just down the block. So they'd go there during lunch. And then in the afternoon, maybe they would stop and pick up, a fancy snack or something for dinner. So all those trips could have been accomplished without a car because the car would have been parked all day. And then this person would have taken their drive home to the suburbs in the afternoon. If all those trips are now occurring in the suburbs as separate one-off car trips, then you're potentially looking at even more miles being driven connecting these various suburban trips than you were before the pandemic, when all of these things could have been accomplished relatively easily as part of someone's downtown commute. So I think that is the frightening situation as far as traffic and emissions is concerned, that actually traffic doesn't go down at all. There was a Wall Street Journal report a couple months ago talking about Tampa, Florida, as a city where traffic is actually worse now than it was before the pandemic. And part of that is what I was just talking about, the sort of these sort of suddenly unlinked trips that are contributing all these miles. But the other part of it, which I think we'll talk more about, is that all of our systems are so much designed to funnel people into these downtown areas. I mean, every the width of every highway, traffic engineers have spent a lot of time thinking about how people move, and to have all this upended very suddenly, I think is putting stresses on points in our transportation system where we weren't expecting it.
And Greg and Robert, anything to add on suburban travel patterns?
No, I think Henry's dead on there for sure.
Indeed, and especially when we think about who's living in these different places. We think about white collar workers, as Henry was laying out, taking the train and from the suburbs to downtowns, and that's certainly part of the scenario. Most of the working poor in this country live in suburban areas, actually, and because we're having these housing crises in center cities and inner suburban areas, pushing people further and further out to find housing that they can afford, is putting more poor people on the roads, and as we talked about before, if they're not working from home, so you can see how this kind of compounds in the suburbs when we think about all the scenarios that Henry laid out.
And Robert, tell us what happened with public transit numbers during the pandemic.
Well, the public transit certainly is going through an existential crisis. All the reporting on this is certainly true. Certainly scenarios that they never expected. You had general managers of transit agencies last March and April begging people not to be riding, which is completely the opposite of what they've done for their entire careers, because they were trying to protect their workforce, protecting the essential workers who are relying on transit. So it's hard to overemphasize just how different everything changed for public transit. But when we think about transit, we also have to break it into the different modes, because transit isn't just one thing. As Henry was laying out, commuter rail systems like the Long Island Railroad or Metra in Chicago, right? These systems that were designed to bring wealthy white collar workers in from the suburbs to downtown have completely created very few people riding in those trains these days. 95% drop offs, really scaled back services all across the board, because as we laid out, those trips just aren't being taken. Heavy rail systems, subways, the New York subway, Washington Metro, have seen big declines as well, 85, 90% in some cases, but it's the same kind of thing as Henry laid out, bringing suburban folks into downtowns. That wasn't necessarily the case anymore, but the bus systems actually is very interesting, only declined probably 60, 50, 40%, somewhere in that area, because what you start to see is the bus systems were really were providing services mostly for low-income folks who had no other option, who weren't working from home, and who still really relied on the bus just for daily activities. And so when we think about transit, and we think about the future of transit, we think about post-pandemic transit, we really have to break it into those different modes, because investing a lot into rail systems, may be a benefit from the prior scenarios we had before the pandemic. What we've seen during and since is a major emphasis on making sure that the bus, which was so maligned for a generation, is providing the same kind of quality service that we got on the rail side as well.
And Greg and Henry, any thoughts from you on what happened to public transit during the pandemic?
Well, I think the dichotomy between surface riders on the bus and those subterranean on subways has several layers, certainly the socio-economic, but if you look at who's riding those modes of transportation, it tends to be minority riders, I would say in the main, on the surface in the buses. And that's because of the penetration that bus routes get, citywide or urban area wide. The opportunity, as we talked about, to walk less than a quarter mile to your stop is much more prevalent with a bus route than it is perhaps with a subway or even a light rail route. So those factors underlie the difference between those numbers as well. But it is a challenging issue. My experience is in New York and Washington, D.C., where I've seen it play out in that fashion, but I would imagine it's got a similar resonance around the country.
So what is the short-term outlook for public transit as people begin to go back to the office? And Greg, we'll turn to you first for this.
Sure. Well, I would say certainly short term, we will continue to see reliance for those who are deemed to be essential workers, those in those communities, as I mentioned, that have come to rely traditionally upon surface transportation. So that is certainly key. I think we'll still continue to see for subterranean, subway or other kinds of transportation users a slow return to usage patterns. There were some early concerns, and some of the early analyses on ridership looked at those going underground as being a bit more wary of their environment, perhaps, than of those who are above ground, breathing fresh air in bus stops where the air circulates freely. So I think we will continue to see, as the specter of the pandemic starts to lift, but it's fair to say we're nowhere near herd immunity yet. So I think we will still see reluctance for recycled air. I think we will see reluctance for those touching those surfaces, even though science has started to kind of delegitimize surface transmission, or at least downplay surface transmission. So that's kind of the short and the long term. It's going to take a while for us to get back to anywhere near the numbers that we had pre-COVID, but I think buses will lead us first, and then subways and light rail will follow. And of course, that reflects back to Robert's point about how many people actually return to normal commute patterns if they're able to work from home.
Yeah, Greg, I'm glad you mentioned the safety issues. So what are some examples of what public transit systems are doing to make riders feel comfortable coming back into crowded cars again, crowded subway and buses?
Sure. Well, I mean, you're starting to see what I would consider innovation in the transit space, and it's not so much innovation from, let's say, exploratory or basic research. It's different ways of utilizing the assets that you have. So things like contactless fare payment systems, all door boarding systems on buses. Back when I was a kid in New York City, if you got on the back door, that was called fare jumping, right? But now, because of COVID, that's an acceptable means of entering and alighting from a bus. You're starting to see improved driver safety with barriers where they're able to have some distance from the folks who are riding on those systems, enhanced vehicle air filtration. As science said, that the ability to have fresh air continuously flowing was something that could reduce the impact or the incidence of COVID transmission. Surface sanitation was key, with several MTAs and other kinds of organizations having routine cleanups for their vehicles, as well as new surface technologies that allowed for kind of antimicrobial transmission, and new innovative surface delivery models. I mean, all of these things I would consider to be innovations that have a long-term positive impact on transit, improving efficiency, quality of future services, and providing transit systems with operational resiliency against future pandemics.
Mhm. And Robert and Henry, do you have anything to add about that? What the long-term outlook is now that people are getting back on the public transit systems?
Well, I think it's very unfortunate that political leaders didn't do more to emphasize that transit with a mask is no more dangerous than anything else anyone does all day. There are many more densely populated, more transit reliant cities in other countries that did not suffer from the pandemic as severely as some rural American areas did. And the fact that New York City became the American epicenter of the pandemic, I think caused a lot of mixing up of correlation and causation with respect to transit and density. And there's just been some really explicit, frankly, fear mongering. And I don't have a problem with transit agencies adapting to make their systems even cleaner than before. You know, that's great. But I wish that people like Andrew Cuomo had stepped up and said, look, subways are not the problem. The apartment buildings are not the problem, because I think even more than a year into this now, that's a perception that unfortunately persists.
Yep.
Yeah, indeed. You can, in Washington, you can go to a baseball game now with no mask, no verification, but you can't ride the subway or ride a bus without a mask. So there is a dichotomy there that I think Henry's right. It's a little unclear. Just say a couple more things. I mean, we do a lot of work with general managers all around the country at transit agencies, and I can tell you 100% that they absolutely spend an awful lot of time making sure that their systems were as clean as possible. And they're putting in these measures. They took it very, very, very seriously, not just for the riders, but also for their workers. And we don't talk enough about the transit workforce. We talked a lot about essential workers back in, the early part of the spring last year, but transit workers themselves were also providing those essential services. And so the general managers took their health and safety very, very seriously. And then just the last thing, the federal money that came in to provide relief for the financial troubles these transit agencies were facing was absolutely invaluable. It's rare that Washington comes to the rescue these days, but there's no doubt that they absolutely did that in this case, keeping that services running.
And of course, the CDC has ever-changing and updated guidance on people that want to get back on mass transit and what the protocol should be. Henry, you talk about public transit avoiding a death spiral. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. So the mass transit death spiral is a concept that is older than the pandemic, but the idea is that the transit agencies enact service cuts, ridership falls because service is not so good, revenue falls because ridership has fallen, and then there are more service cuts because there's less revenue. And this cycle continues: less service, fewer riders, less revenue, less service, and so on until there is no transit system left at all. And I think prior to the two bailouts from Washington, I think this was a real concern. Many transit agencies, including in Los Angeles and New York, previewed what they might have to do if that money didn't come, and the picture was very, very grim indeed. So the question is, if there's no structural long-term operating aid from Washington, then what do these agencies do if ridership doesn't come back? What happens if things level off at 70% of 2019 rider levels? What are they going to do? My first instinct was they're in a lot of trouble, because I thought rush hour is the absolute busiest time for transit. The buses and trains are really full. And so every additional rider there is just money to the bottom line. I mean, it seemed to me that was where transit agencies made the most of their money, and that if you stop getting these big rush hour surges, then they would be in big trouble. And as I did reporting on this, I realized that it is true that they make most of their money at that time, but even more so, they spend most of their money at that time. And so there is a potential adjustment scenario here where transit agencies switch their focus away from rush hour and towards providing off-peak service. And this is something that advocates have asked for a while, because rush hour travelers tend to be whiter, they tend to be wealthier, they tend to be white collar office commuters going downtown, whereas off-peak riders are more likely to be people of color, more likely to be women. So there's been a question for a long time about why these systems are so designed towards serving central business districts. The answer in some cases was that that's literally their purpose, is to alleviate traffic conditions and make CBDs functional. But if we say instead that their purpose is to allow people to live without cars, then it forces a re-examination of the kind of service we want to emphasize. And I think we have seen this in places like San Francisco, where Jeffrey Tumlin at the SFMTA has been very explicit about prioritizing midday off-hour bus routes for essential workers, where he found that ridership went down the least during the pandemic. I talked to the CEO of Metra in Chicago, which is the commuter rail agency there. Metra has probably the most underutilized transportation, like mass transit, hard infrastructure in the country. I mean, the whole city of Chicago is threaded through with these incredible tracks that they use basically not at all. I mean, if you want to get an off-peak train in the middle of the afternoon into downtown Chicago, you're going to be waiting for an hour. And whereas at rush hour service is, every 10, 15 minutes. So their CEO was saying, we're thinking about trying to switch to off-hour service and see if we can pick up more riders then. Now, I'm skeptical that this can really take off with anything but buses if we lose the sort of primacy of the central business district, because there's a lot of hard infrastructure that still heads in there. But the fact remains that these transit agencies spend a ton of money on rush hour. So there is a silver lining to being able to de-emphasize this rush hour service. Just to give you an example, I talked to Zachary Mallet at UCLA, or is he at USC? He's a researcher in Los Angeles who's done research on this specific subject. And he told me that BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit Agency, 40% of their train cars only get used at the peak of rush hour. So 40% of all the cars they bought are just for that peak of peak. And if that peak of peak goes away, you can see how in the future that could lead to many fewer expenses for them. And it also goes to show just how much better rush hour service has been than off-hour service, to the detriment of people who need to use transit to get around at odd hours.
Robert and Greg, any thoughts on that?
No, I agree with that completely. And just to reemphasize the point that the commute trip is not even the largest share of transit trips. Everything that Henry was saying is supported by the evidence of what people are actually taking transit for to begin with. And if we've oriented the entire system towards rush hours, which there's an awful lot of people commuting at the same time, but as that smooths out, you can see how spreading that out throughout the day actually makes an awful lot of sense, because you're serving the trips that people take all throughout the day.
Yeah, and I would say, culturally in this country, we have a challenge with the concept of I won't even call it just transit writ large, but even sharing rides. I mean, it's here in Texas, we're a one man, one truck state. And not to be sexist about it, but it's one person per vehicle, and that's the way we've been socialized. So even the concept of shared rides in a shared economy has fallen a bit short, because it's now just one person per Uber per Lyft instead of the shared rides that concept originally started. So the sharing idea, the collective usage of a transportation asset still remains somewhat of a North Star.
And we have a question from a reporter about I don't know if it's a trend yet, but cities that are going fareless or no fare. And Robert, how many cities are doing that, and how does that impact the financial health of the systems?
Well, many had done it during the pandemic, as Greg was saying, just they were forced to do so, stop collecting fares, mostly to protect their workers and things like that. The ones that will continue to do this, it's a little unknown now. Kansas City was the largest system before the pandemic that had done it. The pandemic accelerated, I think, their plans. And to our point earlier, they saw pretty really low reduction in transit ridership during the pandemic. But famously, Los Angeles just recently is preparing to launch a pilot, I believe, at the end of the summer. It's not clear yet exactly who it's going to be geared for. Probably students, possibly low-income riders as well, but to make the entire system fare-free for the Los Angeles Metro, which would be the largest experiment in the country. And so this is a bit of a challenge because, as Henry was mentioning, transit agencies rely on transit fares for their operations, but not 100%, right? There's not even an agency that comes close to providing their operating costs through ridership fares. In Los Angeles, I think during the pandemic, it was down to 7%, 6% of very, very small numbers. So the idea with this experiment is that you're providing a social service for the people who really need it. The transit riders in Los Angeles are disproportionately low income. They've obviously taken a hit over the last year and a half plus. And so this is really giving them a financial benefit that they've needed. And I was chairing a bus transformation task force here in metropolitan Washington. And we asked people, well, what are you looking for with the transformation of the bus? This is before the pandemic. Elected leaders talk about Wi-Fi and different kinds of electronic augmentation to the system. And what they were looking for was cheaper fares. That's all across the board what they were looking for. Now, coupled with that are obviously other things around reliability and service levels. You don't want to starve these systems. If this fare-free experiments turn into anything that's going to reduce service dramatically and make the system a bare bones kind of operation, that's not going to serve anybody. You've actually undermined the population that you're trying to serve, and you're going to have big problems. So I think what we're trying to do, what I'd love to see us get to, is a system where we have better transit for the reasons that we've already talked about, because we've made good investments over the last year and a half, especially around the bus. People have taken this opportunity to put in bus-only lanes here in Washington, for example, signal priority so that buses can go through intersections, other kind of investments to make the rides better. So all of that service has gone in, not across the board, but in many cases, which is certainly a good thing. If we then spend more time spreading the service around throughout the day, so we're not just serving the peak of the peak, as Henry was talking about earlier, if we can use this as a system where the service is more even throughout the day, and if we have a service that is free or very, very low cost, then you really have done something for the population that you're trying to serve. But it has to have all those components. If you're going to make it free and starve the system, that's going to have big problems for everybody.
Yeah, Greg and Henry, thoughts on the free transit?
Just knowing the economics of how transit organizations operate, I think it would be extraordinarily challenging to go to a fareless model on a permanent basis. So then the question becomes, how do you, striate where the free service is or the fareless services versus those who are paying, and then you get into debates and disputes about who's subsidizing whom. So, transit writ large is already largely subsidized by government. It's, I think it's fairly obvious that the daily fare that an average commuter pays is less than really the value of what they're getting, or really even a fair exchange for the service that's being provided. So, we're already in kind of a catch-up kind of mode with the ridership, and to go fareless long-term, I think would really be problematic.
I would add to that while LA seems like a great test case because it has such low fare box recovery, which, as Robert was explaining, like the fares don't pay for the service in Los Angeles. So they figure, well, why not just make it free? We might even save money on the infrastructure of fare collection. And also a big motivating factor in Los Angeles is to get police off the system. So you don't have police enforcing fare violations, which is sort of infamously have been full of, those arrests have been full of racial bias, right? Like people who get arrested by police for fare evasion tend to be minorities. And in Los Angeles, getting rid of those confrontations is a big goal of getting rid of fares. My concern is, and this is based on reporting people I've talked to, is that there is a direct trade-off in these agencies where the operations budget is extremely limited between making transit free and making transit better, which is to say making service better. I'm not shocked to hear that Robert found that Washington area riders wanted cheaper fares. But again, if you're only asking existing riders what they want, then there's a selection bias issue there, right? Those are people who already use the system, for whom the system's current network is working. And I would argue that in a city like Los Angeles, for example, there are many, many, many more people who do not use the system who could if the service were better. There's an app, an app that helps you figure this out, where you can, I'll post it in the chat in a moment, but you can go and look at how underserved a city is by transit relative to population density and what you would expect. You'll find that Los Angeles is extremely underserved. It's something like 13% transit service compared to closer to 60% in places like Chicago and Washington, D.C. And so what you're seeing there is, yes, the riders who currently use the system would like fares to be lower or perhaps free. But if they were to instead put that money towards improving service, who knows how many more riders they could bring onto the system. I think the fact that transit is free, it's not the only, the rider's time is worth something too, right? So like, how free is a bus if you have to wait 45 minutes for it? And that's not just metaphorically. I mean, you're literally missing an hour of work at which you'd be paid $15, California minimum wage, to get on a free bus. I mean, does that trade-off make sense? I think not.
We have a comment and a question from a reporter from Advanced Media, New Jersey, who says that New Jersey Transit and PATH trains have reported higher weekend ridership. So what should transit agencies do to accommodate and encourage this source of ridership and thus increased revenue? Anyone?
Well, I'd be interested in hearing in which direction they're heading. If it's a all Manhattan, take advantage of New York City path and then return home, that might lead to one set of accommodations, where if it's a bit more spread out, and the answers may be different. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's kind of how I would maybe start the analysis. I didn't mean to cut you off, Robert.
No, but I think anecdotally we've seen, especially in the Northeast corridor, higher levels of congestion on the weekends in recent months. And so I don't know if people are starting to use transit to avoid that congestion, because as we've talked about already, the quote unquote rush hour is changing. And if we see different levels of congestion at different points of the week, you might see people trying to use different alternatives in order to avoid that kind of congestion.
All right, let's get back to the highways, which is how most Americans get to work. Greg, let's talk about speeding and crashes and what we've seen.
It was kind of an interesting set of data to come out from the pandemic. So despite decreases in traffic volumes and a decrease in the overall number of crashes during the pandemic, fatal crashes went up surprisingly. And TTI's exploration of the data indicates that higher speeds, although that not necessarily excessive speed beyond the speed limit, played a major role. So the decrease in traffic congestion appears to have allowed drivers to have more freedom to choose higher speeds. And although there were fewer crashes, those that did occur probably happened at those higher speeds. And even relatively modest increases in speed result in a higher risk of injury and fatality. So for example, the 10% increase in speed means a 50% increase in the chance of a fatality. And I would add on to that, single driver off roadway, particularly in rural areas, still is a leading factor. Many times those causeways are tree lined, and those are not the kinds of crashes that have a high survivability rate. And then you add in the increase in day drinking and other, intoxicants for folks who felt trapped at home during the depths of the pandemic. That certainly didn't help matters at all. But yes, the fatality numbers went up even though traffic levels were down.
Greg, if you could expand on that, I don't know if your data is that granular, but how many of those increased fatalities involved alcohol or other substances?
I would say in this country, we still have a pernicious 25% of our unfortunate annual fatality rate, of 35 to 40,000. I would say about 10,000 of those remain impairment crashes. It's a bit more difficult when you factor in now legalization of marijuana. I don't think law enforcement agencies have been consistent in determining how to include those under impaired drivers, or even those who are using legitimate and legal over-the-counter or prescription meds. They can fall into those categories as well. But writ large, it's about 10%, I'm sorry, it's about 25%, or 10,000 crashes per year tend to fall into that category.
And Robert and Henry, anything that you have observed about what's happening now that people are getting back on the highways? All right, Henry, Robert, maybe we could talk about the outlook for toll roads post-pandemic.
Yeah, I think the outlook for toll roads actually is very good. Several metro areas, Washington one included, have invested in a pretty innovative network of new kinds of toll roads that are geared towards charging people based on the real-time traffic levels. So if you're driving at a time when there's not a lot of traffic, you would pay very little or nothing. If you're driving at the peak of the peak, you would pay an awful lot more. And if a lot of things we've talked about already will come true, if more people are going to be driving, if congestion levels are going to go back up or be worse, those regions that have invested in toll roads and invested in this kind of congestion relief strategy are probably showing themselves to be pretty prescient about that. It matters today because of all the reasons we talked about. If we're trying to smooth out that rush hour, toll roads are a great way to do that. If you try to encourage people to drive away from the peak of the peak, toll roads can certainly help do that. If you're trying to make a dent in things like climate, toll roads can help do that, not just because it takes cars off the road, but because you're encouraging carpooling in many cases. Some of these new systems are toll free if you have more than 2 or 3 people in a car. And a lot of that money in cases goes directly into providing for alternatives. Here in Northern Virginia, part of Washington, the money that's being generated from toll revenue is going for enhanced bicycle facilities, enhanced public transit in different corridors. So, all those things have to be lumped together in order to get the best bang for the buck. Connected to all this are these issues around congestion pricing. I mean, New York was getting ready to launch the biggest experiment about charging people to drive into an area as opposed to just on a corridor like a toll road. I think some of that has been derailed for now, but a lot of other regions throughout the country, San Francisco, Washington, Boston, Chicago, to some extent Seattle, are looking at this in order to figure out how do you take the benefits of dynamic tolling in corridors and the experiments for cordon pricing, charging people to go into an area in order to benefit climate, equity, and resiliency goals. So a lot of interesting things hopefully going to be happening over the next few years.
And Greg and Henry, any thoughts on toll roads or other alternative roadways?
Well, I certainly remember from my time in Washington, some of the criticisms or observations, not to disparage any automaker, but they were calling them Lexus lanes because of the increased pricing during dynamic pricing during rush hour, particularly. And if I recall correctly, there was one instance where Highway 66 had a toll in total of up to about $30. So, was it even more than that, huh? So yeah, I got a bargain. So, when you start to look at pricing strategies at that level, you can understand how folks are being priced out, and that it's perhaps not having the impact on reducing congestion as much as you otherwise would think. The flip side of the argument is, well, if somebody's going to have a $30 toll, maybe I'm giving a good look at the bus or the metro. But it's going to be an optic. There are going to be those that are proponents and those against. Certainly here in the state of Texas, toll road is now a four-letter word, even though it is a four-letter word. But it's no longer in the quiver of DOT and asset managers to consider the application of toll roads for their particular area. It really has become a politically charged issue.
And Henry, I know you have a specific interest in parking. So can you tell us a little bit about parking as an indicator and a determinant of behavior?
Sure. So I'm writing a book about parking, so I'm biased, but I also chose to write a book about parking because it's the most important thing. It makes the world go round. Parking as an indicator first. You can tell a lot about how a downtown or a commercial strip or a mall is doing by how full the parking is, right? I mean, this is like an old, there's an old, possibly apocryphal story about investors using Google satellite, using satellite data of big box stores around Christmas time to anticipate their earnings based on how many cars were in the lot. And I think you can do something similar downtown, where if you look at garages in like the Loop in Chicago, for example, you can get a sense of who's coming back to work and when they're coming back and how they're coming back. Obviously, we've seen a lot of people shift from mass transit to driving to get downtown. That's good news for parking garages. But I would say that is not, what you're seeing there is not exclusively people trying to get away from a potential COVID risk of transit. Rather, parking is a big determinant of the way people use transit. I mean, one of the biggest factors in determining the share of people who drive alone into a center city is how much parking is there and how much does the parking cost. So as you see fewer people commute to work, parking prices will fall, parking occupancy will surge, and garages will get cheaper and fuller. And then at some point, the supply and demand will correct themselves. So that's going to play out over the next few months, I think, and we'll find some sort of equilibrium there. But the second thing I would say is that in cities where you don't have a lot of people taking transit, who can switch from transit to driving and fill up that garage space that's being emptied out by the new remote workers, in those cities, you'll start to see a real excess of parking in places that are built to accommodate 100% of people working from the office 5 days a week, right? So in places like Dallas, say, or Houston, I wouldn't be surprised to see parking garages start to empty out, especially parking lots on the fringes. And then I think you come to this interesting point where maybe those turn from parking sites into development sites, and you start to see those are the places where the new post-pandemic downtown begins to emerge on those parking lots where parking stops being such a lucrative use of the land. And then those become the places where developers reconsider, what are we trying to do with this downtown? If offices are not so full anymore, but residential demand remains really high, maybe those are the places where downtowns start to reposition themselves as more mixed use live work areas, like we've seen happen in places like Chicago, New York, and downtown LA in the last couple decades.
And of course, employers have a huge voice in when and how workers go back to the office. So how can businesses make a difference as people go back to the office? Greg?
Well, I would say, if we're serious about a sustainable future of commuting, then companies really need to get serious about providing flexible work schedules to promote a shift from peak to non-peak commuting, or incentives to encourage public transportation for commute. And when we talk about, flexible schedules, it's not just incumbent upon the employees. I would say it's incumbent upon employers to visit with other employers in any particular region or CBD and say, look, we're going to go to an 8 a.m. start. Why don't you have a 9 a.m. start? Why don't you have a 10 a.m. start? And we will rotate it on an annual basis so that, you stretch out rush hour so that rush hour isn't as impenetrable as it currently is. So flexibility and creativity in that regard would be extraordinarily helpful. But it also becomes more important to provide connected infrastructure with alternative mode options, especially for people who will be looking to live farther away from the urban core in order to accommodate their telework or work from home considerations.
And Robert, what are you hearing about what employers are thinking of doing or are already implementing?
Well, in most regions throughout the country, the business communities always played a major role in transportation planning. It's mostly for new investments, right? They when there's major things that come before voters on election days for ballot measures for them to approve, sales tax increase or something else to pay for increased transit service, the business community is usually the ones that are there leading the charge. I think everything that Greg said is exactly right. As we kind of emerge from this pandemic, those big capital projects probably need another look because they're usually based on models for former commuting patterns. So then what do they do, right? They still need to be present in these major metropolitan transportation conversations. Let's have them use their innovation, their ideas to figure out new ways that we can do all the things we talked about here today. Provide better service for the people who really need it, especially low-income workers that they serve. How do you spread out that rush hour so it's not just concentrated in the morning and afternoon peak? And how do you make sure that we're reaching these other goals around climate at a time when everybody expects transportation emissions to continue to increase? That's a perfect role for the business community.
So we're getting down to the end here, and Robert mentioned capital projects, infrastructure projects. So I wanted to hear your predictions for President Biden's infrastructure bill. What line items do you think are most important, and do you think they will survive? And let's start with Greg.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. My days at DOT go back to the Obama administration when the conversation was about roads and bridges when you talk about infrastructure. So I know the Biden administration attempted to really broaden that definition, and I commend them for that. But I think probably where we sit today, politically and realistically, it's going to be difficult to get that across the finish line, particularly when roads and bridges still tends to dominate the conversation. So having said all that, one thing I do think there will be support for will be more broadband connectivity in the infrastructure final legislation, which will make particularly rural areas and the parts of inner cities without good connectivity much easier places to work, to complete schoolwork, to have access to health care, including telehealth, and to make purchases online. So technology, including reliable broadband to more locations, will be critical in order to fully realize telecommuting's potential and take advantage of everything we've discussed in this conversation.
Henry?
Well, I probably, it seems like it's changing every minute. I don't think that I know more than necessarily the people on this call about what the odds are of a bipartisan bill, whether that's going to get support from left-wing senators who want climate provisions in the bill. The one thing I would say about transportation infrastructure as it concerns cities is that there really is no sense in supporting another round of major urban mass transit investments without changes in land use. You look at some of the big mass transit projects of the last 20 years, a lot of them have been disappointments, and that's because we haven't changed the land use around transportation. Look at Los Angeles. Los Angeles has spent more money than any other metro area on new transit in the last 20 years. And what do they have to show for it? Ridership is lower than it was 10 years ago, than it was 20 years ago. And that's because when you take a train in Los Angeles, you're either running right down the center of a highway, a freeway median, or you're running through a neighborhood of single family homes. And that's despite tremendous demand for living near transit in Los Angeles. They just, the land use changes haven't come with transit. And if we're going to spend billions on new transit, I think we should really make sure that it comes with changes in land use as well.
And Robert?
I agree with both comments very much. I do think there's a lot of great stuff in the president's plan. You know, despite all this nonsense about what's in, what's out, what's infrastructure, what's not. You know, I hope we can get away from that conversation. The Treasury Department basically includes all of this pretty much as investment. That's how we've scored it for a generation here in this country. I think there's one or two things that maybe don't fit that category, but the administration doesn't call it an infrastructure plan anyway. They call it a jobs plan. So I hope we get away from just that frame of it. But you know, by any measure, it's the most significant proposal we've seen in decades. We've talked about infrastructure, and at least here in Washington, for a number of years with really nothing to show for it, mostly because we haven't figured out a way to pay for it. The administration has laid out a way to pay for it. That obviously is controversial. It doesn't have support from Republicans on the legislative side, but you know, we're starting to move something. I mean, the tangibility of this has made this really exciting, and the administration's propensity to use federal spending to address these big issues, the economic, environmental, and all that, is consistent with their approach so far. So it's a frustrating conversation because of the politics, which transcends an infrastructure conversation. Like the other two speakers, I'm not going to predict one thing or another. But you know, it's clear that there's a 50 senator strategy. There's a 60 senator strategy. You know, as Henry was saying, I don't know what it happened, what it is today. Yesterday was probably different, but it literally changes that fast. But the pay fors are what's going to matter here if they decide to go that route, as opposed to what they can do through budget reconciliation. So if we, you know, the president's already taken off things like a gasoline tax, you know, off the table. You know, so the pay for is really what it's going to come down to, which I think is going to lead us to more of this budgetary strategy that they talked about from the beginning.
And I'm going to combine two questions from reporters on the call into one. They're asking about the future of living without a car or commuting by bike. Any thoughts from any of the panelists on those two things?
Well, I spent some time during the pandemic in Paris, which is the city which has responded to the pandemic and people's concerns about mass transit by installing these massive bicycle superhighways that trace the routes of the busiest metro lines above ground. So you can sort of, it becomes easy to navigate and replace your subway commute on a bike. And one of the results of that is a lot of people biking, a lot more women and children riding bikes. I'm not sure that is an important lesson for American cities in terms of commuting, because American commutes tend to be so long. But as we've discussed, and no disrespect to the title of this session, but commuting is a relatively small share of the trips that Americans make. And that is true both of transit trips and of driving trips. And so if we can think about ways to adapt neighborhoods, especially if more people are spending more time in their neighborhoods working remotely, the lesson that I draw from Paris is both, if you build it, they will come. Because people really need this secure infrastructure to feel safe riding a bicycle or a scooter or taking their kids with them on a road where people are going 30 miles an hour. And then the second thing is it can happen overnight. There is no reason that new bicycle infrastructure, new infrastructure to make it easier to live without a car needs to take 3 years of community meetings. It can literally be laid down overnight.
Yeah, and Sandy, I would just chime in real quickly. I agree 100%, but I still see bicycles as a short trip solution. So maybe those inner city or inner community trips would be able to take advantage of that technology, not so much the long commutes as Henry pointed out. But with respect to self-driving cars, they're coming. The challenge will be, will we still see one person per vehicle, which does nothing to address congestion? It may help with environmental issues if they're electrified or other low emission technologies. But they will be a benefit to those in the disability community and elders, as well as the ability to perhaps send those who have not yet attained a driver's license safely from point A to point B. So the future is bright in that regard.
And Robert?
Just to quickly echo, I think that it's possible to live without a car if we start to do the things we've talked about here today, smoothing out the transit service throughout the day. So, kind of, as Henry said, you can't be without a car if the alternatives are just geared around the daily commute, right? So you need it all throughout your daily activities. So that would really help that. I think there's a lot of anecdotes about what's happened to biking over the last year and a half, anecdotes about bikes not being available and bike shops having big long delays. And I think anecdotally, I've seen a lot of people have seen more bikes on the roads. I'd love to see more reporting on that, some more data, and try to figure out what actually is happening. I've heard folks suggest that because some people are working from home, they're more attuned to what's going on in their neighborhoods. They're walking around a lot more and they're seeing cracks in sidewalks and unsafe intersections. And that's driving a bigger conversation. Again, I don't think we have good data on it yet, but it certainly feels like this is something that's here to stay.
So Robert gets the last word. So our thanks again to Robert Puentes, President of the Eno Center for Transportation, Gregory Winfrey, Agency Director of the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, and reporter Henry Graybar of Slate. Resources from this webinar will be posted for your use at nationalpress.org, where we make good journalists better. Thank you.